He walked into St. Mary's Trauma Center at 11:47 p.m., wearing scrubs and a calm smile, and the first thing he did was shoot the security guard in the throat. Not the chest, not a warning. The throat deliberate practice meant to silence before the scream could form. The guard crumpled against the front desk, and the man in scrubs didn't even look down. He stepped over the body like it was a bag someone had dropped in the hallway, raised 2 fingers toward the entrance, and 4 more men flooded through the automatic doors with rifles already raised. One of them ripped the phone off the reception desk and smashed it against the floor. Another hit the emergency intercom panel with the butt of his weapon until it sparked and went dark. These men had not come to rob St. Mary's. They had come to erase it. If this story moves you, please subscribe to our channel and follow along until the very last word, and drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Ava Cooper had been on her feet for 9 hours when the first shot echoed through the East Quarter. She was in Base 7 retaping an IV line on a 63-year-old man named Gerald, who had come in complaining of chest tightness and left arm numbness. Gerald liked to talk. He had been telling her about his daughter's upcoming wedding in Portland, how he'd been saving for 2 years for the venue deposit, how he was terrified of the father-daughter dance because he had 2 left feet and couldn't keep a rhythm to save his life. Ava had smiled at that. She told him she understood completely, that sometimes your body knows things your mind hasn't caught up to yet. Then she heard it. Not a car backfiring, not something falling in the supply room. She knew the difference between those sounds and what she just heard the way most people knew the difference between a knock and a gunshot. Her hands stilled on Gerald's IV line. Her eyes moved to the hallway. The chatter at the nurse's station fell quiet for exactly 1 second, that particular kind of quiet that happens when a room full of people all stop breathing at the same time. Then someone screamed. "Stay here," Ava said. Her voice came out flat and steady, which surprised even her. Gerald looked at her. What was? "Stay in this bed. Do not get up. Do not open the curtain." She leaned in close so he could see her eyes. "I need you to trust me right now, Gerald. Can you do that?" He nodded, and she was already moving. She pushed through the bay curtain and into the main corridor. 3 nurses were backed against the far wall. One of them, a young woman named Priya, who had only been on staff for 4 months, was pressed flat with her hands over her mouth, her eyes enormous. Ava caught her gaze and held it, and with one small motion, a single flat palm pushing down, she communicated everything she needed to without making a sound. "Stay low. Stay still." Dr. Jason Lee came around the corner from the surgical corridor. At almost the same moment, his white coat half open and his face doing something Ava had never seen it do before. Jason Lee was the kind of surgeon who narrated his own procedures with quiet confidence, who could hold a bleeding artery and simultaneously ask a resident about their weekend plans. Right now, he looked like a man who had heard something that had broken something in his understanding of the world. "There are men with guns," he said. His voice cracked on the last word. "At the front desk. Marcus is down. Ava Marcus is down." Marcus, the overnight security guard, 24 years old, saving money for community college. Ava had brought him coffee every shift for the past 8 months. She felt the information land in her chest and then move through her like cold water. And then something else happened, something she hadn't felt in almost 4 years. The noise in her mind went very quiet, not the quiet of shock, the quiet of focus. "Jason," she grabbed his arm. "Look at me. How many did you see?" I don't know, 4, maybe 5. Were they moving toward the elevators or staying at the front?" He blinked. "Moving. They were moving toward the—" "Why are you asking me like that? We need to call." "The phones are down," Priya said from against the wall. Her voice was barely a whisper. "I tried. The desk line is dead. I tried my cell, and I have no signal." Ava looked at the ceiling. There were jamming devices. That meant this had been planned. That meant these men had scouted the hospital, mapped its communication systems, and killed the first person in their way without hesitation. This was not random. This was not a robbery. This was an operation. She needed 30 seconds to think. She gave herself 10. The ICU was on the 4th floor, 47 patients, overnight staff of 11. If whoever had sent these men knew anything about hospital layouts, and they clearly did, the ICU was the most vulnerable point because it held the patients least capable of moving themselves to safety. It was also the most likely target if the goal was casualties. Maximum impact, minimum resistance. "Everyone listened to me," Ava said, and something in how she said it made everyone listen. Even Jason, who had 20 more years of experience and a medical degree from Johns Hopkins, went still. "We are not calling 911 because they have jammed the signal. That means we are on our own for the next several minutes. I need you to take every patient in these bays and move them into the interior rooms. No windows. Close the doors, turn the lights off, and don't open them for anyone until you hear police badges and voices you recognize. Do you understand?" Priya nodded instantly. The other two nurses exchanged a look and then nodded. Jason stared at Ava. "And you, I'm going to go find out how bad this is." "That's not Ava, you're a nurse. You can't just—" "Jason." She met his eyes. "Trust me." She left him standing in the corridor with his mouth half open and moved toward the stairwell. She didn't run. Running was noise and movement and panic. She walked with the measured precision of someone who knew exactly how many steps it was to the stairwell door, how much weight to put on the handle to open it silently, how to position her body against the frame before entering so that anyone on the other side would see the door before they saw her. Old habits, muscle memory pressed so deep it lived beneath thought. The stairwell was empty. She let the door close behind her and stood still, listening. Footsteps on the floor above two sets heavy moving toward the third-floor landing. Voices low but not whispering. They weren't trying to be quiet. They didn't think they needed to be. That was their first mistake. She was one floor below them, one staircase flight. In another life in the life she had spent 4 years bearing under 12-hour shifts and grocery runs, and the small ordinary acts of being invisible, she would have had a rifle, a radio, and a 4-man team at her back. She had none of those things. What she had was a hospital full of people who couldn't protect themselves and the specific terrible knowledge of exactly what she was capable of. She began moving up. The third floor housed pediatric overflow and the long-term recovery ward. Lower foot traffic than the ER. Quieter. She pressed against the stairwell wall and eased the door open 3 inches, just enough to see the corridor. 2 men, both armed with tactical rifles. One was older, heavy-set, with a scar cutting through his left eyebrow. The other was younger, moving too fast, breathing too hard, nervous, which made him dangerous in a different way than the older one. They were moving door to door, checking rooms, not looking for valuables, looking for something specific. She watched their pattern for 15 seconds, how they moved, which way their eyes went, where their muzzles tracked, which one's hand was steadier. The older one, his was steadier. He was the one to worry about. She had no weapon. That was the reality she was working inside, and she didn't waste energy on frustration. Frustration was a luxury. She had a hospital, 4 floors of hallways, supply closets, crash carts, oxygen lines, and medical equipment that most people looked at and saw healthcare, and she looked at and saw options. She let the door ease closed and went back down the stairs. She moved through the ER bay corridor, silently scanning, cataloging. A crash cart in the alcove by Bay 12 defibrillator, which was useless right now, but the cart itself was heavy and on wheels. A fire extinguisher mounted to the wall beside the janitorial closet. Inside the janitorial closet, she knew from 9 months of working this floor, there were industrial cleaning supplies, a mop bucket, and a shelf of maintenance tools, including a box cutter and a pair of heavy-duty bolt cutters that maintenance kept meaning to relocate and never did. She collected the box cutter and the bolt cutters. She took a length of oxygen tubing from a supply shelf. She took a moment to think through what was upstairs, what was likely coming down, and what she needed the next 60 seconds to look like. This was what people never understood about her job, either job. The planning was everything. Execution was almost the easy part. The hard part was doing the math in your head, while every instinct you owned was screaming at you to move faster, hit harder. Do something right now. The discipline was knowing that right now was almost never the right time. Almost. She heard the stairwell door on the ER level bang open. 1 man. He came through fast and turned the wrong direction first, which gave her 2 seconds. She used them. She moved to the edge of the alcove, pressed flat, and listened to his footsteps close the distance. He was moving toward the supply corridor. His breathing was controlled. Trained then, not a hired amateur. He came even with the alcove doorway, and Ava moved. She didn't hit him. Hitting a man that size and that trained was a short conversation with a bad ending. She went for his weapon first, both hands angled across, using his own momentum to break his grip before he could register what was happening. His surprise was the 4 seconds she needed. The bolt cutters caught him across the temple, once hard, in the specific place that ends a conversation immediately without ending a life. He went down heavy. Ava stood over him for one breath, checking the quarter both ways, and then she had his rifle. She checked the magazine. Full. Safety was off, which told her something about how he'd been operating. She safetied it, slung it across her back using the oxygen tubing because it was the length she needed, and dragged him inside the supply closet. She locked the door from the outside, and then she stood in the ER corridor alone with a rifle on her back and the sound of footsteps on every floor above her, and she felt for the first time in 4 years completely terribly like herself. She hated that it felt that way. She had worked so hard to stop feeling that way. Back in the ER bay corridor, she pulled out her phone. No signal, they were jamming everything. But the hospital had a hardwired intercom system that ran separate from the phone network, and the secondary intercom panel was in the supply room behind the nurses' station. It was old. It wasn't on the same grid as the main communication board. If they'd only hit the primary systems, it might still work. She moved toward the nurses' station. Priya was still there, crouched behind the desk, with 2 of the other nurses and an orderly named Damon, who looked like he was holding everything together by sheer stubbornness. "The secondary intercom," Ava said quietly. "The old one in the back supply room. Is it still active?" Priya blinked. I think so. We never use it. It connects to the hospital PA and to the admin offices on 5. It also connects to the external emergency band," Damon said, surprising her. He must have caught her look because he added, "I used to work at County before I came here. Their old system was the same model. If you switch it to channel 4 and hold the bypass key, it broadcasts on the emergency frequency." "That's what I needed to know." She looked at Priya. "I need you to get to that room, get on channel 4, and broadcast our location and the situation. Don't stop until someone answers you." "Can you do that?" Priya looked at Ava's face, then at the rifle on her back, and seemed to make a decision about who Ava Cooper actually was. "Yes," she said, "I can do that. Go now. Stay low. Don't use the main corridor." Priya went. Ava turned to Damon. "How many staff are you aware of on this floor right now?" "Counting us, maybe 8 nurses, 2 residents, and Dr. Lee." "Anyone unaccounted for?" "Sandra was doing rounds on the East Wing when it started. I haven't seen her." Sandra Reyes, 12-year veteran, tough as ship rope, and as stubborn as anyone Ava had ever worked with. She was also diabetic and had mentioned that morning that she'd forgotten her afternoon insulin dose. If Sandra was trapped somewhere on the East Wing in an acute stress state, her blood sugar was a clock ticking alongside everything else. "I'll find her," Ava said. "You get everyone in this area into the interior rooms. Nobody in any room with a window. Close everything. If you hear gunfire and it's not me, stay in the rooms." Damon looked at her steadily. "And how will we know if it's you?" "Because if it's me, Ava said, "no, the shooting will stop." She left him standing there working out what she just said, and she moved toward the East Wing. The East Wing corridor was dark. They'd cut the main lighting, which meant they'd access the hospital's physical infrastructure, the breaker panels most likely on the basement level. She pulled out a pen light from her scrub pocket, kept the beam low, and moved along the wall. She found Sandra Reyes in the medication room, halfway down the corridor, barricaded inside with 3 patients. She'd apparently herded in from the hallway the moment the shooting started. Sandra was a large woman with short silver hair and the particular kind of calm that came from having handled every form of human disaster for over a decade. She'd pushed a medication cart against the door and was sitting on the floor with a 14-year-old boy who was trying not to cry, telling him quietly that everything was going to be fine, in a tone that made it sound like fact. Ava tapped the door in a specific pattern, 3 short, 2 long. It was random, but it was something, and it was enough to make Sandra open the door rather than barricade harder. Sandra took one look at Ava, at the rifle, at her expression, at the way she was standing, and said very quietly, "Oh, okay then. Are you okay? Your insulin. I'm managing, these 3 aren't." She meant the patients. Two elderly women who appeared to be from the long-term ward and the teenage boy. The boy has a fractured wrist from earlier. The women are post-surgical. They can walk but not fast. Can you get them to the interior stairwell on the south side? It bypasses the main corridor. I know the building, Ava. I know you do. That's why I'm trusting you with this. Sandra studied her for a moment. You want to tell me who you really are? Ava looked at her. Not right now. Fair enough. Sandra stood, straightened her scrubs, and turned to her three charges with a smile that could have belonged to someone running a bake sale. Okay, friends, we're going to take a little walk, nice and quiet. You follow Ms. Sandra and everything is going to be just fine. Ava watched them go, the steady, unhurried rhythm of Sandra moving three frightened people through the dark like she was born for exactly that purpose. And she thought that there were all kinds of people who were built for crisis. They just showed up in different packaging. She turned back to the east corridor and listened. 4 floors above her, someone was giving orders. She couldn't make out the words, but she could make out the cadence, someone issuing instructions to multiple people systematically, efficiently. That was the command element. And command elements in operations like this one had a specific target they were working toward. They weren't here for patients. They weren't here for drugs or equipment. There was something in this hospital or someone that had put a coordinated mercenary team in the building tonight. She needed to know what it was. She started up. The second floor was partially occupied. She moved through it quickly, checking rooms, directing terrified staff with short, firm instructions, her voice quiet enough that it didn't carry past the people she was talking to. A respiratory therapist named Chris, who was hiding under a supply cart, came out when she told him to and helped her direct 2 ambulatory patients into a bathroom with a lock. A medical student, so new she was still wearing her orientation lanyard, grabbed Ava's sleeve and said, "What's happening? What do I do?" And Ava said, "You do exactly what I tell you, and you do it without asking why." And the student had looked at her and nodded like she was a lifeline, because Ava was a lifeline. That was the whole unbearable irony of standing in this corridor with a rifle she'd taken off an unconscious man while wearing scrubs she'd put on at 6 that morning. She was exactly what this building needed, and exactly what she had spent 4 years running away from. 3 separate times in the past 20 minutes, she had processed tactical information that the version of herself who worked at St. Mary's should have found incomprehensible. She had estimated ranges, assessed weapon types from sound-mapped movement patterns, and calculated approach angles. None of it felt foreign. All of it felt like breathing. She was halfway up the staircase to the 3rd floor when she heard the voice. Male. Calm. American accent, slight northeastern edge, coming from the landing above her. Ghost team report. Who's clearing the 2nd floor? Silence for 2 seconds. Ghost 3 report. Silence. She had taken Ghost 3 out of commission in the ER corridor 20 minutes ago. His absence had just been noticed by whoever was running this operation, which meant they now knew something in this building was hunting them. The voice on the landing said slowly and with the particular flatness of someone updating a threat assessment in real time, "We have a problem." Ava pressed against the stairwell wall and waited. And 4 floors above her, a man named Garrett Cole, former Special Operations 3 combat tours, currently operating under a private contract that had cost someone a great deal of money to put together, looked at the communication device in his hand and came to the same conclusion she had. Someone in this hospital was not who they appeared to be. He had 60 seconds before his employer called for a status update. He had an asset somewhere on one of these floors that needed to be extracted before law enforcement arrived, and law enforcement was coming. Because even with the communication jamming, a hospital going dark in downtown Seattle was going to pull response eventually. He had a team that was now running 1 man short and hadn't yet figured out why. He keyed the radio. "All ghost units hold positions. We have a possible hostile element inside the building. Do not engage independently. Confirm and respond." 4 responses came back, not 5. Ghost 3 was still silent. Cole's jaw tightened. He looked toward the stairwell. And in the stairwell, 4 floors below him, Ava Cooper unslung the rifle, checked the safety, and started climbing. She counted the steps as she climbed. Not because she needed to, she knew the stairwell by heart after 9 months of using it every shift, but because counting gave her something to anchor her breathing to. 4 steps per landing. 12 landings to the 4th floor. She kept her back to the wall and her weight on the outer edge of each step where the concrete was less likely to creak under pressure. Old habit, the kind that kept people alive in buildings where being heard first meant dying second. She stopped at the 3rd floor landing. The voices she'd heard earlier, the command element above her, had gone quiet. That was worse than noise. Noise told her where they were. Silence meant they were repositioning, and repositioning meant they'd taken her seriously as a threat, which meant Garrett Cole, or whoever was running this team, was smarter than she'd hoped and exactly as dangerous as she'd feared. She pressed her ear to the stairwell door and listened for 4 full seconds. 1 set of footsteps, moving away from her toward the north corridor. Unhurried, either oblivious or deliberately projecting confidence. She filed the sound away and kept climbing. The 4th floor door had a small, wire-reinforced window at eye level. She came up beside it at an angle never straight on, never silhouetted, and looked through. 2 men in the corridor, one posted at the ICU entrance, rifle across his chest, watching the door. The second standing further down, facing the other direction, speaking quietly into a radio she could see clipped to his vest. The ICU entrance had a keypad lock. The man at the door hadn't broken through it yet, which meant they either didn't have the code or they were waiting for something. She had the code. Every nurse on rotation did. The question was how to get through a door guarded by 2 armed men without a firefight that would send rounds through ICU walls where 47 people were lying in beds they couldn't get out of. She needed them separated. She went back down 1 flight, moved to the 3rd floor corridor, and found what she was looking for in the supply alcove near the nursing station, a hospital-issue emergency call device, the kind attached to bed rails, so patients could summon help with a button press. It ran on its own internal battery and transmitted to a receiver panel. The 3rd floor receiver panel was 15 feet down the corridor from where she was standing. She pressed the call button. The panel lit up with a soft, persistent beeping tone, quiet enough not to carry through floors, loud enough to draw attention from anyone in the immediate area who was trained to respond to it. She moved back to the stairwell, propped the 3rd floor door open exactly 2 inches, and waited. It took 40 seconds. Then she heard the 4th floor stairwell door open above her and footsteps descend 1 set, which meant the man with the radio had come to investigate, and the one at the ICU door had stayed put. 47 patients were still behind a closed door with 1 guard instead of 2. That was the geometry she needed. She let him pass. She came through the stairwell door onto the 4th floor before the sound of his footsteps on the staircase had fully faded. The man at the ICU door had his back partially toward her. He was watching the stairwell. His partner had just ascended, which meant his attention was behind him and to the left. She had maybe 3 seconds of clean approach before his peripheral vision would pick up movement. She used 2 of them. She hit him from behind with everything she had, not violence for its own sake, but the specific focused application of force to the one place on the human body where consciousness was most efficiently interrupted. He went down without making a sound that carried. She caught him before he hit the floor. She keyed the ICU door code 7419, the same it had been for the last 8 months, and it opened. The ICU smelled like everything she'd spent 9 months associating with this job. Antiseptic, recycled air, the low, steady rhythm of monitoring equipment. 11 nurses and orderlies looked up at her from various points across the room with expressions that moved through shock and terror and something close to relief in the span of about 2 seconds. Charge nurse, Dolores Whitman, 61 years old, 38 years of nursing experience, a woman who had managed everything from mass casualty events to full cardiac arrest on double shifts, crossed the room in 6 steps and grabbed Ava by the arm. "There are men outside," Dolores said. "1 fewer than there were a minute ago," Ava said. "Are all patients accounted for?" "Everyone's here. 3 on ventilators, we can't move them. 2 are sedated, 2 are restrained for agitation protocols. The rest are awake and frightened." "Okay," Ava looked around the room. "I need the crash cart away from the door. Move everything on wheels to the interior wall. If anyone comes through that door that isn't me, you use the cart as a barricade and you move everyone toward the back corridor. There's a service exit in the rear of the unit. Do you know it?" "Of course I know it. It connects to the freight elevator shaft and there's a maintenance ladder inside. It's a tight fit, but it works. If you have to move, you take that route. You leave the patients on ventilators last because they'll need manual bagging, and I need someone with enough hands to manage that. Dolores stared at her, the particular stare of someone rapidly reassembling their understanding of a person they thought they knew. Ava, what are you? Right now, I'm the person trying to keep everyone in this room alive. She met the older woman's eyes. After tonight, you can ask me whatever you want. Deal. Dolores let go of her arm. Deal. What do you need from us? A radio if anyone has one, a cell signal if anyone managed to keep one, and time. A younger nurse in the back, a man named Theo, who was barely 26 and had been a nurse for less than a year, raised his hand halfway. I have an old two-way radio. Personal one. Well, I use it to talk to my brother when we go hiking. I don't know if... Give it to me, Ava said. The radio was a basic handheld, the kind you bought at an outdoor supply store. It wouldn't penetrate the jamming signal the intruders had deployed on the hospital's communication systems because those systems were digital. An analog handheld radio on a different frequency might slip through the edges of the jamming field depending on what hardware they were using downstairs. She turned it on, moved through channels. Static on most. On channel 9, she caught a fragment, a voice-distant traffic noise behind it. Someone outside the building. She keyed the transmit button. This is St. Mary's Trauma Center in Seattle. We have an active shooter situation. Multiple armed men inside the building. I need police response to the main entrance. Do not use the front doors. They are being monitored. West Service entrance ground level. Repeat, this is an emergency broadcast from inside St. Mary's. Can anyone copy static? Then faint but unmistakably real a voice. This is Seattle PD Unit 44. We are say again your location. St. Mary's Trauma Center downtown Seattle. Active shooter, at least 5 armed men. 1 security officer confirmed down. We have patients who cannot be evacuated. West Service entrance ground level. How long before you're on site? A pause. Noise. Traffic noise. Then units are on road, estimated 6 minutes. Can you stay on this channel? I'll try. She lowered the radio, looked at Dolores. 6 minutes. Dolores nodded once tightly. Then we wait. You wait, Ava said. I don't. She was back at the ICU door before Dolores could say another word. 6 minutes was both a long time and no time at all, depending on what Garrett Duarte decided to do with them. He had already noticed the absence of Ghost 3. He was about to notice the absence of the men she'd taken off the 4th floor. Each missing piece of his team was a message she was sending him, and the message was this: whatever you thought you walked into, tonight you were wrong. She moved back to the stairwell and went up. The 5th floor housed hospital administration offices, conference rooms, record storage. During the day, it was full of people. At this hour, it should have been empty, which made it the ideal command position for someone who needed high ground visibility over the atrium and access to the hospital's remaining hardline infrastructure. If Cole was running this operation, that was where he'd put himself. She came through the 5th floor stairwell door and immediately stopped. The administrative corridor was lit, not by the overhead lights which were still cut, but by a portable tactical light someone had set up at the far end of the hallway. It cast long shadows and created a bright point that would make anyone approaching from her direction completely visible while leaving the far end of the hall in relative shadow. Basic tactical positioning. Create a kill zone, put your target in the light. She didn't walk into it. She counted 3 doors between her position and the light source. The first 2 were offices. The third was the hospital's administrative conference room, the big one with the long windows overlooking the atrium. If she could get through the second office without being seen, she could access the atrium side corridor and come at the light from a perpendicular angle. She tried the first office door, locked. The second unlocked. She went through it. The office belonged to the hospital's director of operations, a meticulous man named Harold Fitch, who kept his desk immaculate and his credenza stocked with, among other things, a very heavy glass paperweight that Ava picked up and put in her scrub pocket because sometimes useful things were just sitting there waiting to be used. She moved through the office to the interior door that connected to the adjoining conference room, eased it open 1 inch and listened. 2 voices. Still no response from Ghost 3 or Ghost 6. I heard you the first time. That was a different voice. Calmer. Precise. Cole, she thought. This was Cole. Reframe the problem. We didn't lose two men to bad luck. Someone in this building is actively working against us, which means our window just got shorter. Do we abort? A pause. Long enough to tell her something. Not until we have the package. We're 12 minutes out from the extraction window. That doesn't change. The package, there it was. This entire operation, the attack, the jamming, the coordinated team, the systematic cutting of communications was cover for the extraction of something or someone from inside this hospital, which meant somewhere in St. Mary's there was a patient who was more than a patient, or a document that was more than a document, or something that someone had paid a great deal of money to retrieve quietly and was now paying even more to retrieve loudly. She needed to know what it was. She also needed to not get shot in the next 12 minutes, which felt like a competing priority. She was about to ease the conference room door further open when the radio in Cole's hand crackled. A voice she didn't recognize said, "We've got police radio activity on the monitoring scanner. They're mobilizing. Minimum 4 units ETA under 10. Cole said, "Then we move now. Get to room 412. Bring the asset to the east stairwell. I'll meet you on 3. Room 412. She'd been in the ICU on 4. Room 412 was just outside the ICU wing, a private isolation room that she'd walked past 100 times. She'd assumed it was occupied by a surgical patient. She'd never had a reason to look closer. She had a reason now. She pulled back from the conference room door, moved through the director's office, and was back in the stairwell in 12 seconds. Back down to 4. Through the floor door, past the unconscious man she'd left at the ICU entrance, and down the corridor. Room 412 was at the end of the hall. The door had a privacy curtain drawn across the interior window. Standard practice for isolation. Except the privacy curtain had been there since she'd started her shift. She'd walked this corridor at least 4 times tonight, and it hadn't moved. Not once. No nursing staff had entered, no vitals checks, no medication rounds. Because whoever was in that room wasn't a patient. She put her hand on the door handle, pushed it open. The man in the bed was maybe 55, gray at the temples, lean with a kind of stillness that didn't come from sedation. His eyes were open. He was watching her with an expression that communicated with remarkable economy that he had been waiting for exactly this moment, and was deeply unsurprised that a woman in nursing scrubs had just come through his door holding a rifle. "Room service," she said. He almost smiled. "You're not one of Cole's people." "Definitely not." "Then you're either with the agency or you're the luckiest nurse alive." "Third option," Ava said. "I work here. Who are you?" He sat up slowly, moving with the careful deliberateness of someone managing real pain. "My name doesn't matter right now. What matters is that the people coming to this room in approximately 90 seconds are not here to take me somewhere safe. They're here to make sure I don't testify next Tuesday." She processed that. "You're a witness." "Federal. The man who hired Cole runs a trafficking operation out of 3 Pacific Northwest ports. I've been building the case for 3 years. Apparently he found out about the trial date." He looked at her steadily. "You need to get me out of this building." "I'm working on getting 47 ICU patients out of this building," she said. "You're going to have to get in line." He blinked. That was not the response he'd expected. Good. People who expected less from her made mistakes. "Can you walk?" she asked. "Yes." "Without help." A pause. "Mostly." "Mostly I can work with. Stay behind me. Don't speak unless I ask you something. If I tell you to get down, you get down and you don't ask why." "Understood." He looked at her for a moment in a way that reminded her of the look Jason Lee had given her in the corridor 40 minutes ago, that rapid, disorienting recalculation of a person you thought you understood. "Understood," he said. She put her hand back on the door, then stopped. Footsteps in the corridor, coming fast, more than one set. They'd made up the 90 seconds she'd estimated they were here now, and they were coming from the direction of the stairwell she'd used to get to this floor. She looked back at the man. "Window, how high are we comfortable with?" "4th floor window." He looked at her. "Not very." "Okay, different plan." She looked at the room, at the bed, at the medical equipment, at the ventilation panel near the ceiling, at the bathroom door on the far wall that she knew because she'd used this hospital for 9 months, and she knew its bones better than its architects probably did, connected through a shared ventilation shaft to the supply room 3 doors down. "How small can you make yourself?" she asked. He followed her eyes to the ventilation panel and said quietly, "You have got to be kidding me." The panel comes off with a quarter turn on both screws. The shaft is 18 inches across. "You'll fit." "I'm 6 feet tall." "You'll fit if you breathe out." She was already pulling the bed aside to reach the panel. "The footsteps outside that door are Cole's people, and they are not coming to check your vitals. So unless you have a better option." The door handle moved. Someone on the other side tried it, then tried it again with more force. She'd locked it behind her, 12 seconds, maybe 15, before they put something heavier into it. She had both panel screws off in 8. She looked at the man. He looked at the 18-inch opening in the wall. He looked at the door, which was now vibrating against its frame. "Fine," he said, and he moved toward her. She got him into the shaft with 4 seconds to spare, not gracefully, not quietly, but completely, and she pulled the panel back into place from the inside and held it there with both hands in the dark and did not breathe. The door to room 412 came open with the sound of metal giving way. 2 voices, entering, fast-moving through the room, checking the bathroom. "He's gone." How the room was covered. Clearly it wasn't. That was Cole's voice entering now, measured and cold. Somebody helped him. Same somebody who's been running through this building like she owns it. A pause. She could feel the weight of his attention moving across the room. "Find her," he said. "She's the priority now. The witness is secondary." His footsteps moved toward the ventilation panel. Stopped. Ava held the panel perfectly still and did not breathe and did not think about anything except the structural integrity of her grip and the absolute necessity of being invisible. Cole said nothing for 5 full seconds. Then he said, "East stairwell. Move." His footsteps moved away. Ava breathed. In the absolute dark of the shaft pressed against a federal witness she'd met 4 minutes ago with police, 6 minutes out, and a mercenary commander who now knew she existed, she made the decision she'd been postponing since the moment she'd heard the first shot in the ER corridor. She wasn't hiding anymore from any of it. She pushed the panel back open and dropped into the supply room on the other side. The federal witness came out behind her, breathing hard but intact, and she steadied him with one hand and was already moving with the other. "Stay close," she said. "We're going to the west stairwell." "You said the police were 6 minutes out." "They were. That was 3 minutes ago." "So 3 more minutes. 3 minutes is a long time," Ava said, and she meant it in every possible way. She came out of the supply room into the 4th floor corridor and turned toward the west stairwell and stopped cold. Garrett Cole was standing at the end of the corridor. He was looking directly at her, not at the place she'd been, not at a door she'd come through, at her specifically, precisely the way a man looks at someone he has already assessed and categorized. He was holding a radio in one hand and nothing in the other, which was either the most confident thing she'd ever seen or the most alarming. He said, "You're not hospital staff." "I'm a nurse," Ava said. "You took down 3 of my people." "2, she said. "The 3rd one I'm not sure about. He might have just had a headache." Something shifted in Cole's expression. Not quite a smile. The recognition of something he respected and didn't want to respect. "Who are you?" Outside the building in the near distance, she heard sirens. Cole heard them too. His jaw tightened. He looked at her, at the rifle, at the federal witness behind her, at the 4 floors of hospital she had apparently moved through like smoke, and the calculation in his eyes was visible, even from 30 feet away. He made a choice. He turned and walked toward the east stairwell. Ava stood in the corridor and watched him go, and she knew with absolute certainty that this was not over. Men like Cole did not walk away from a contract failure. They walked away from the immediate situation. Those were different things. But right now the sirens were close, and a hospital full of people needed to know they could stop being afraid. And somewhere on the 1st floor, Priya was still crouched over an old intercom trying to broadcast their location to anyone who would listen. And Gerald in Base 7 was lying in a hospital bed with his IV line half retaped, wondering if he was going to see his daughter get married in Portland. Ava turned around. The federal witness was leaning against the corridor wall, breathing through his mouth, looking at her with the expression of a man who had revised his understanding of the situation several times in the last 5 minutes and was still revising. "You're going to be okay," she said. He looked at her. "Were you always a nurse?" She started walking toward the west stairwell, and he followed, and she didn't answer the question. Some things were answers she wasn't ready to say out loud yet. The sirens outside got louder. Below them on the ground floor, she could hear the sounds of the hospital beginning to come back to life. Voices, movement, the collective exhale of people who had been holding their breath for over an hour. Somewhere Priya was still talking into an old intercom. Somewhere Sandra was guiding 3 patients through a maintenance corridor. Somewhere Jason Lee was sitting with his back against a wall trying to make sense of a night that had shattered every assumption he had ever made about the woman who brought the security guard coffee every morning and never talked about herself. Ava kept walking. She had 3 minutes before the first police officers came through the West Service entrance. 3 minutes to get a federal witness to ground level and make sure every civilian in this building understood that the worst was over. 3 minutes. She moved faster. The west stairwell door hit the ground floor landing with a sound that echoed up all 5 floors, and Ava didn't slow down. She came through it with the federal witness 2 steps behind her and nearly collided with the first police officer. Through the service entrance, a woman in a patrol uniform with her weapon already drawn, who took one look at the rifle slung across Ava's back and made a decision about the situation in roughly half a second. Down, weapon down, hands where I can see them. Ava dropped to one knee, unslung the rifle with both hands extended, and set it on the floor in front of her, and said clearly and without any urgency, "My name is Ava Cooper. I'm a nurse on staff here. I am not a threat. The man behind me is a federal witness in protective custody. There are armed men in this building. I count 3 still active, possibly more. One of them, the team leader, went toward the east stairwell approximately 4 minutes ago. His name is Garrett Cole, former special operations working a private contract." The officer stared at her. Her weapon didn't move. "How do you know all of that?" "Because I've been inside this building for the last 90 minutes while your units were driving here," Ava said. Her voice was completely level. "I can give you a full situation report, but I need you to let me stand up first." Another officer came through the service entrance behind the first. Then 2 more. The corridor filled fast. Ava stayed on one knee with her hands visible and her eyes on the first officer's face, and she read the exact moment the woman made her decision, the fraction of a second where assessment became action and the weapon came down. "Stand up," the officer said, slowly. Ava stood. The federal witness came forward from behind her and said in a voice that carried the particular weight of someone accustomed to being listened to, "Agent Daniel Reyes, Department of Justice. I need to speak to whoever is running this response immediately." The officers looked at each other. The first one keyed her radio. Ava stepped back and let Reyes do what he did. She was already thinking past this moment, past the immediate handoff, past the controlled relief of having police in the building. Because Cole had walked away from her in that corridor with the specific calm of a man who was not panicking, and men like that didn't walk away. They repositioned. She caught the arm of one of the arriving officers, young guy, maybe 28, who was scanning the corridor with his weapon raised and his jaw tight with adrenaline. "4th floor ICU, she said. "There's a charge nurse named Dolores Whitman. She has 47 patients, 3 on ventilators. She needs officers up there now. The ICU entrance code is 7419. He looked at her. "Are you authorized?" "The code is 7419, she repeated. 47 patients, 3 on ventilators. Go." He went. She turned and went back into the stairwell and started climbing because nobody had told her to stop and she wasn't going to wait to be told. She reached the 2nd floor and pushed through into the corridor and nearly ran into Jason Lee. He was standing in the hallway with his back to the wall and both hands pressed flat against it behind him, like the wall was the only thing keeping him vertical. He looked at her with an expression she didn't have a name for, something between relief and accusation, and a kind of raw disorientation that she recognized because she'd felt it herself the first time she came back from deployment and tried to sit in a normal restaurant and eat a normal meal and couldn't remember how to make her hands stop shaking. "Ava," he said. "Jason, are you hurt?" "No." He looked at her at the scrubs, at the places on her hands where she'd been moving equipment and bodies and panels in the dark, at the particular way she was standing. "What is happening?" "Who are you?" "Oh, I'm exactly who I've been for the past 9 months. "That's not an answer." "I know." She put a hand briefly on his arm. "Everyone on this floor, are they safe?" He pulled himself together with visible effort. Jason Lee, she thought, was the kind of person who functioned best when he had a task. Give him something to do and he came back to himself. Yes, I got everyone into the interior rooms like you said. Sandra came back with 3 patients from the East Wing she said you'd sent her. There are 12 staff members I'm aware of, all accounted for. Patients are stable as far as we can tell, without proper monitoring. Okay, police are on the ground floor. You can start bringing people out. He nodded, started to move, then stopped and turned back. The security guard, Marcus. She'd been carrying Marcus with her since the first minute, the name sitting in her chest like a stone she couldn't put down. I know, she said. Is he? I don't know yet. She met Jason's eyes. Go get your people. He went. She kept moving up. The 3rd floor was empty. Now she'd cleared it herself earlier, and the men she'd encountered hadn't returned to it. She moved through it quickly, checking rooms by instinct, her eyes cataloging everything, and her mind running a continuous calculation about Cole, where he'd gone. What 12 minutes to the extraction window actually meant for a man who'd already missed it. She stopped in the middle of the corridor. Extraction window. That was what Cole had said in the administrative conference room. 12 minutes from that moment, which meant a vehicle, a location, a secondary exit point. And he'd been talking about extracting the witness, but the witness was now in police custody on the ground floor. Cole's contract was blown. His window was gone. So why hadn't she heard him leave? She went very still. The hospital's east stairwell, where Cole had walked when he left the 4th floor corridor, didn't connect directly to the outside. It terminated at the basement level, which housed the mechanical plant, the loading dock, and the hospital's fuel and utility systems. It was also where the jammers had been placed. She was certain of that now. Whoever had set up the communication blackout had done it from the basement because that was where the central communications infrastructure was physically rooted. Cole hadn't walked away. He'd gone down. She turned and ran for the east stairwell. She hit the basement level door at full speed and came through it the way she'd been trained, wide low to the right, weapon up, eyes moving. The basement was warmer than the floors above it. Industrial hum from the mechanical systems. Emergency lighting only casting everything in flat orange. She moved along the left wall and swept the space in sections, the way you cleared a room when you didn't have a partner watching your 6 and couldn't afford surprises. The jamming hardware was in the second alcove, 3 units military grade plugged into the hospital's secondary power grid. Still running, she pulled them one by one and threw them against the far wall. They hit the concrete and died, and she felt the sudden weight of communications coming back online. Not literally, but she knew that upstairs, phones were lighting up, that police radios were clearing, that the chaos of the last 90 minutes was suddenly finally acquiring a perimeter. That was when she heard the breathing. It was coming from behind the maintenance shelving unit along the east wall. Controlled, deliberate breathing, the kind of breath pattern a trained person used when they were staying calm in a situation that had gone sideways and were in the process of deciding what to do next. She put her back to the wall and moved along it. Cole, she said. Silence. The witness is in police custody. Your team is either captured or down. I've got officers coming through this building floor by floor, and your comms just came back online so they know exactly where to look. She paused. The math has changed. A long pause. Then his voice came from behind the shelving, rough and controlled. Who are you? Ava Cooper. I'm a nurse. You're not a nurse. I'm a nurse who used to be other things. She kept moving slowly along the wall. Army, 12 years, 2 combat tours, 4 covert deployments. I was a sniper for the last 6 years of my service. Another pause, longer this time. She could feel him recalibrating. That's why my people went dark. That's why. You did that alone, with hospital equipment and a rifle you took off Ghost 3. It was a long night, she said. She heard him move a shift of weight, a deliberate adjustment, and she stopped and raised the rifle and said, "Don't." The movement stopped. "I'm not going to shoot you," she said. "That's not what I'm here for, but I will not let you walk out of this basement until the officers upstairs know you're down here. Those are the 2 options. Come out on your own or wait for them to come to you." Silence. She counted the seconds. 1, 2, 3, 4, vitamam. Then Garrett Cole stepped out from behind the shelving with his hands at shoulder height and his face doing something complicated, not fear, not quite. the expression of someone doing an honest accounting of how the evening had gone and finding the ledger deeply unfavorable. He was taller than she'd expected, broader, the kind of physical presence that filled a doorway and made people step back without knowing why. He looked at her across the orange-lit basement with his hands up and his jaw set, and she could see him doing the same calculations she'd been doing since the first-floor corridor, reading her, measuring her, filing her away. "You could have left," he said. "When you had the witness, when the police arrived, you could have handed him off and gone back to being a nurse." "I could have," she agreed. "Why didn't you?" She looked at him steadily. "Because there are still people in this building who are scared. And because Marcus Webb is 24 years old and somebody shot him in the throat tonight because he was standing at the wrong desk." She kept her voice even. "I needed to know where you were." Something moved through Cole's expression that she couldn't fully name. Not guilt. She didn't think men who planned operations like this one carried guilt as a working emotion. Something more like recognition. The acknowledgement of a professional from one professional to another. He said, "Marcus Webb is alive." She felt everything in her go still. "What? Your security guard." He was still breathing when my team moved past him. The round caught the side of his neck, not the carotid. He was unconscious, but not... Cole stopped. "I'm telling you because you should know. Not because I'm asking you for anything." Ava stared at him for 3 full seconds. Then she lowered the rifle 2 inches, not all the way, not fully, but enough to mean something, and said, "The officers upstairs have a description of you, and they're going to find this basement in approximately 4 minutes. If you have anything to say before then, now is the time." He looked at her. "Who sent you here tonight? Who knew I was operating in this city?" It took her a moment to understand what he was asking. "Nobody sent me," she said. "I work here. I was on shift." He stared at her. "You're telling me this entire night happened because a former Army sniper happened to be working her regular nursing shift in the building my team hit?" "Yes." He said nothing for a moment. Then quietly and with the tone of a man who rarely said anything he didn't mean, "That is extraordinary bad luck." "For you," she said. "For me," he agreed. The stairwell door above them opened. Boots on the stairs. Multiple sets moving fast and organized, police coming down with radios active and weapons ready. Ava didn't move. Cole didn't move. They stood in the basement, looking at each other across 12 feet of orange light in a night that neither of them had expected. "One more thing," Cole said, and his voice dropped half a register. "The man who hired me, he didn't just find out about the trial date. He has someone inside the DOJ. Reyes needs to know that before he testifies because whoever it is will try again." The footsteps on the stairs were close now. "Who?" Ava asked. "I don't know the name. I know the department. Criminal Division Oversight." He kept his eyes on her. "Tell Reyes. He'll know what to do with it." The stairwell door burst open and 4 officers came through it with weapons up and voices loud, and Cole put his hands back at shoulder height and turned to face them, and Ava stepped to the side and let the process happen. She watched them move Cole against the wall, watched the handcuffs go on, watched the controlled professional machinery of law enforcement take over the situation that she'd been managing alone in the dark for the past hour and 40 minutes. One of the officers looked at her, a sergeant older, with the particular exhausted competence of someone who'd worked too many nights to be surprised by much. He looked at the rifle. He looked at her scrubs. He looked at the disabled jamming units on the floor. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "can you tell me what happened down here?" "I'll tell you everything," she said. "But first I need to know if the security guard at the front desk is alive." The sergeant looked at her for a moment. Then he keyed his radio. "Unit 12, what's the status on the civilian down at the front reception desk?" "Static." Then a voice, "Ambulance on scene. He's got a pulse. They're working on him now." Ava breathed. The sergeant was looking at her with the expression she was going to be seeing on a lot of faces in the next several hours, that particular recalibration that scrambled to fit a new picture over an old one. "You're the one who cleared the upper floors," he said. It wasn't quite a question. "Mostly," she said. "And you're a nurse." "I work here, yes." He looked at the rifle one more time. "Okay," he said slowly, like the word was doing a great deal of work. "Okay, I'm going to need you to come upstairs with me." She followed him up the stairs and into the first floor corridor, in the building that had been dark and terrified for the past hour and 40 minutes was something different now. Lights were coming back on. The engineering staff had found the breaker panel and were restoring power floor by floor. Police radios crackled constantly. EMTs were moving through the main entrance with equipment. Somewhere above her, she could hear the sound of the ICU coming back online, monitoring equipment ventilators. The steady rhythmic beeping that in any other context was just background noise, but right now sounded to Ava like music. She came through the corridor toward the nurse's station and stopped. Priya was sitting on the floor behind the desk, with her back against the cabinet and the old intercom handset resting across her knees, and she was crying in the very quiet, depleted way of someone who has been holding an enormous thing for a very long time and has finally been allowed to put it down. When she saw Ava, she pressed both hands over her face for a moment, and then she pulled them away and looked up. "I got through," Priya said. "On Channel 4. I got through." "I know you did," Ava said. She crouched down beside her. "You did exactly right. I didn't know what else to do. I just kept talking." Priya looked at her with red eyes and something in her face that was trying to work out the right question to ask. Did you always?" She stopped, started again. "The way you talked to us, before, when you said to get everyone into interior rooms, you didn't sound like a nurse." Ava looked at her. "I was always both things," she said. "I just only needed one of them most days." Priya absorbed that, nodded slowly like she was filing it somewhere she'd be able to find it later. Damon appeared from the interior corridor with 6 other staff members behind him, all of them moving with the sunned, careful energy of people who had come through something and weren't entirely sure yet what it had cost them. When he saw Ava, he stopped and just looked at her for a long moment, and then he said, "You told me the shooting would stop if it was you." And he spread his hands. "It stopped." She almost smiled. The sergeant who'd come up from the basement with her reappeared at her shoulder. "Ms. Cooper, the lead investigator is going to need to speak with you," and he paused, looking at something behind her. "I think some other people do too." She turned. Agent Daniel Reyes was standing at the far end of the corridor with 2 men in dark jackets who had the unmistakable posture of federal law enforcement, and he was looking at Ava with an expression that communicated across 30 feet of fluorescent-lit hospital hallway a great deal of gratitude and a great deal of curiosity, and perhaps just a small amount of the specific awe that people sometimes felt when they realized they'd been saved by someone they'd badly underestimated. She walked toward him. "Agent Reyes," she said, "you need to hear something. Something Cole told me downstairs before your people brought him in." She kept her voice low. "He said whoever hired him has a source inside the DOJ Criminal Division oversight. He didn't have a name, but he wanted you to know before Tuesday." Reyes went very still. The 2 men behind him exchanged a look that confirmed they'd understood the weight of what she just said. "How do you know he wasn't playing you?" Reyes asked, trying to create confusion before the trial. "I don't know for certain," she said, "but he gave me that information after his team was taken, after his contract was blown, after he had nothing left to gain from me. People in that position usually don't perform." She met his eyes. "He said you'd know what to do with it." Reyes looked at her steadily for a long moment. "Who are you?" he asked, and the question was genuine, not rhetorical. "Ava Cooper," she said. "I'm a nurse. I work on this floor." He waited, clearly expecting more. She didn't give him more. Not yet. One of the federal agents behind him leaned in and said something quietly into Reyes's ear. Reyes listened, and something changed in his face. An incremental shift. A new piece of information landing. He looked at Ava again. "Your service record," he said carefully. She said nothing. 12 years Army, sniper qualified, 4 covert deployments, 3 of which are still classified at a level I don't have clearance for. He paused. "One of my colleagues recognized your name from a report. Something that happened in Kandahar in 2019. The name of that city landed in her chest like a weight she'd been carrying so long, she'd forgotten it was there. She kept her face still. "That report is classified." "Yes," Reyes said. "It is." He looked at her, at the scrubs at the rifle she'd handed off to the sergeant downstairs, at her hands at the hospital around them. "Why are you here, Ms. Cooper? Working nights in a trauma center?" She thought about how to answer that. She thought about Marcus Webb, 24 years old, being worked on by paramedics at the front desk. She thought about Gerald. Gerald in base 7, who was probably still lying in that bed with his IV line half retaped, thinking about a father-daughter dance in Portland. She thought about Priya sitting on the floor with an intercom handset, just talking, just keeping the line open, because that was what she'd been told to do. Because this is where people need help, she said, and I know how to give it. Reyes held her gaze for another moment. Then he nodded a single slow nod that seemed to contain something more than simple acknowledgement. We're going to need a full debrief, he said. Everything that happened tonight, every contact, every conversation. Starting with Cole. I know, she said. I'll tell you everything. She meant it. She was done keeping that part of herself in a box labeled closed. Not because tonight had changed who she was. She was always both things exactly as she'd told Priya, but because maybe the two halves had been trying to be the same person this whole time, and she'd just been too stubborn to let them. Above her, the fourth floor came fully back online. She heard the ICU monitoring equipment settle into its steady rhythm. She heard Dolores Whitman's voice carrying even through a floor and a ceiling, projecting the specific, unshakable authority of a woman who had been nursing for 38 years and intended to continue telling someone to check a pressure reading and someone else to get a warm blanket for the patient in bed 6. The hospital was breathing again. And somewhere across the city, Garrett Cole was sitting in the back of a police vehicle working out where the night had gone wrong, and the answer he kept arriving at was the same one every time a woman in nursing scrubs who had no business being what she was, standing in a building she had no business, holding alone, refusing to be anything other than exactly what she was. Jason Lee found her 20 minutes later, standing in the corridor outside base 7, looking through the curtain at Gerald, who had fallen asleep with his hands folded on his chest and his face peaceful in the way that older men's faces sometimes go when the body has decided that whatever danger existed has passed and it's safe now to rest. Jason stood beside her. He didn't say anything for a moment, just looked through the curtain at the sleeping man. He asked me 3 times if you were coming back, Jason said finally. I didn't know what to tell him. Tell him I'll finish fixing his IV line in the morning, Ava said. Jason turned to look at her. He opened his mouth, closed it, looked at her again with the full weight of 9 months of working side by side with someone and the specific unsettling sensation of realizing you never actually knew them. The FBI agent out there, Jason said, he's asking for you. I know. And there's a reporter outside the service entrance. Word's getting out. That I expected. Ava, he stopped, tried again. Is any part of this? All of it is real, she said quietly. Every shift, every patient, every cup of coffee I brought Marcus. She looked at him steadily. I was never pretending to care about this job. There were other things I didn't want to bring into it. Jason was quiet for a moment. What changed? She looked at Gerald, sleeping behind the curtain. She thought about the shot she hadn't taken tonight, the moment on the 5th floor, when Cole walked away from her and she let him, because she'd had 2 choices, and she'd chosen the one that brought more people home whole. Nothing changed, she said. I just stopped pretending I could keep the 2 halves separate. She pushed away from the wall and walked toward the front of the hospital where the lights were brightest and the questions were already waiting, and she didn't look back. The FBI arrived in force 40 minutes after the police, which was about as fast as anyone could expect, given that the call had gone out on a compromised channel from a handheld hiking radio held by a nurse who had spent the previous 90 minutes dismantling a mercenary operation with bolt cutters and borrowed weapons. They came in 3 vehicles, set up a command post in the hospital's administrative conference room on the 5th floor, the same room where Cole had been running his operation 2 hours earlier, which struck Ava as either ironic or efficient, depending on how you looked at it. And then they sent a woman named Special Agent Carol Mathers to find Ava Cooper and bring her upstairs. Mathers was somewhere in her mid-40s, compact and precise, with the kind of face that gave nothing away and the kind of eyes that took everything in. She found Ava in the ER corridor, helping Priya reestablish patient vitals on the bay monitors that had come back online when power was restored. Mathers stood at the edge of the bay and waited exactly 45 seconds while Ava finished what she was doing, and Ava appreciated that. A lot of people in Mathers' position would have interrupted. The ones who didn't were usually the ones worth talking to. Ms. Cooper, Mathers said when Ava stepped away from the monitor. I'm Special Agent Carol Mathers, FBI Seattle Field Office. We need to speak with you upstairs. How's Marcus Webb? Ava asked. First thing, before anything else. Mathers didn't hesitate. He's in surgery at Harborview. The round caught the lateral neck, missed the carotid by 11 millimeters. He lost significant blood, but the paramedics stabilized him before transport. She paused. The surgeon said it's going to be close. Ava absorbed that. 11 millimeters. The distance between a life and a different outcome measured in a unit smaller than the width of her thumb. She nodded once and said, "Okay, lead the way." She followed Mathers to the 5th floor without speaking, which Mathers seemed to understand and respect. The elevator was working again. Power fully restored, and they rode up in silence and stepped out into the administrative corridor that 3 hours ago had been Cole's command position and was now crawling with federal agents and windbreakers cataloging every surface. The conference room had been set up fast and efficiently, a laptop, recording equipment, 2 chairs across from each other at the end of the long table. Reyes was there looking less pale than he had on the 4th floor, but still carrying the particular gauntness of a man who had spent several hours genuinely unsure whether he was going to survive the night. There was another agent Ava didn't recognize, younger, sitting to the side with a legal pad. Mathers sat across from Ava. Reyes stayed standing. "Before we begin," Ava said, "I want it noted that everything I tell you tonight I'm telling voluntarily. I'm not represented by counsel. I'm not requesting immunity. I'm a witness who was present during an active threat event, and I want to give you everything that will help your case." Mathers looked at her. "Noted. And I want to know before I say anything else whether the information I gave Agent Reyes about the DOJ leak is being acted on." Reyes said from his position near the window, "We made 3 calls within 15 minutes of you telling me. It's being handled at a level above this office." "Good." She settled back in her chair. "Then ask me whatever you need." They asked her everything. It took 2 hours and 14 minutes, and she gave it to them straight, not the truncated version, not the edited version, not the version designed to make anyone comfortable. She gave them Cole's real name, the structure of his team, as she'd assessed it, the number and position of each man she'd encountered, the conversations she'd overheard in the conference room, the specific language Cole had used about the extraction window and the package. She described the jamming hardware in the basement and its position and the make and model as best she could identify from what she'd seen in the emergency lighting. She told them about the intercom bypass on Channel 4, about Priya's call, getting through about the hiking radio, and what frequency had worked. She did not tell them everything about herself. She answered their direct questions honestly. Yes, prior military service. Yes, sniper qualified. Yes, the deployments Reyes had mentioned in the hallway were real, but she didn't volunteer what wasn't asked because some of those files were classified for reasons that hadn't expired, and some of that history belonged to people other than her. Mathers was sharp. She caught the edges of what Ava wasn't saying the way good investigators always did, and she didn't push. She filed it and moved on, which told Ava that Mathers had already been briefed on enough of Ava's background to know where the lines were. When it was over, Mathers set down her pen and looked at Ava directly. "You took considerable personal risk tonight," she said. It wasn't quite a question. "There were people in this building who couldn't protect themselves," Ava said. "You neutralized at least 3 armed and trained men using improvised equipment and a weapon you took in the field. One of those men was a former Special Forces operator." Mathers' voice was professional even, but something underneath it wasn't quite neutral. "That's not something a nurse does, Ms. Cooper." "No," Ava agreed, "it's not. Is there any part of your decision to work here at St. Mary's in this specific capacity that had to do with the protective detail situation involving Agent Reyes?" Ava looked at her. "No," she said. "I had no prior knowledge of Reyes or his case. I came to St. Mary's 9 months ago because I needed a job that was useful in a life that was quiet." She paused. "Tonight was not what I planned for when I took this position." Mathers studied her for a moment. "No," she said finally. "I don't imagine it was." She closed the laptop. "We're going to need you available for follow-up. Don't leave Seattle." "I live 4 blocks from here, Tim," Ava said. "I'm not going anywhere." She walked out of the conference room and into the administrative corridor and stood there for a moment with her back against the wall and her eyes closed. The fluorescent overhead lights were humming at a frequency she'd never noticed before. The carpet under her feet was the same institutional gray it had always been. Nothing about this floor had changed, And yet everything felt different in a way she couldn't entirely locate, like when you return to a place you used to know well after a long absence and find that the geography is exactly as you remembered, but the scale is completely wrong. She pushed off the wall and went back downstairs. The ER was beginning to resemble something close to functional. Not normal was weeks away, maybe months, but functional. Nurses were at stations. Monitors were tracking. 2 patients who'd been evacuated during the attack were being brought back to their bays by orderlies who moved with the careful efficiency of people operating on adrenaline, already spent, and professionalism taking over where adrenaline left off. Damon was at the far end of the corridor with a clipboard doing a head count that he clearly didn't need Ava to ask him to do. Sandra Reyes, no relation to the federal agent, a coincidence that the night had offered without irony, was in a supply room eating a granola bar with the focused intensity of someone whose blood sugar had been in dangerous territory for 3 hours and was now correcting with extreme prejudice. Jason Lee was standing at the nurse's station with a cup of coffee and the expression of a man who had made peace with the fact that this night was going to change how he understood several things and was working out which ones to tackle first. He handed her the coffee when she came even with the station. "I made it the way you usually drink it," he said. She took it. It was black, no sugar, which was exactly right. "Thank you." He leaned against the counter. "The FBI was up there a long time. They were thorough. Are you in trouble?" She looked at him over the rim of the cup. "No. Because if you are legally, or if you need Jason." She set the cup down. "I'm not in trouble. Everything I did tonight was within the bounds of what a civilian is permitted to do in an active threat situation. Plus, I have a concealed carry permit for the state of Washington, and the rifle I used belonged to someone who had no legal right to be carrying it inside a hospital, so the chain of custody argument is fairly clean." She paused. "I also have a military service record that's going to make a lot of what happened tonight difficult to prosecute, even if someone wanted to try." He stared at her. "Did you just run through the legal analysis in your head in real time?" "I've been running it since the 2nd floor," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Priya told me what you said to her about being both things. What about it?" "She said you told her you were always both things. You just only needed one of them most days." Ava picked up the coffee again. "That's accurate. Did it feel like that, working here?" He looked at her carefully. "Did it ever feel like you were, diminished, hiding something?" The question was more perceptive than she'd expected, and she gave it the honest answer it deserved. "Some days," she said, "early on, when it felt like I'd put something down that I was never supposed to put down, and I was pretending it didn't exist." She thought about how to say the next part. "But most days it felt right. It felt like the other half of the same thing. Keeping people alive looks different depending on which side of the situation you're standing on. I got used to standing on this side." Jason absorbed that. He looked toward Bay 7, where Gerald was still sleeping. "He woke up about an hour ago," he said. "Asked for you immediately. When I told him you were upstairs with the FBI, he said, and I quote, 'I knew there was something going on with that woman.'" Ava almost smiled again. "Almost. I'll check on him before I go," she said. "You're leaving." "I've been on shift for," she checked the clock on the nurse's station wall, 11 hours and 40 minutes. "I need to sleep." Jason looked at her. There was something in his face that had been building for the last 20 minutes. Something he'd been deciding whether to say. "Before you go," he said, "in the East Corridor, earlier tonight, when you told me to trust you." He stopped. "I almost didn't. I want you to know that. I was about to argue with you, and then something in how you said it made me stop." He paused. "I'm glad I stopped." She looked at him steadily. "So am I." She finished the wine and set the cup on the counter and went to Base 7. Gerald was awake, propped up against the pillows, and he looked at her when she came through the curtain with an expression that mixed relief and curiosity and something genuinely warm that surprised her. "There she is," he said. "Here I am." She checked his IV line. "How's the chest? Better than it was before all the excitement?" He watched her hands on the line. "They're saying on the news that a nurse held off a bunch of gunmen. They're going to say a lot of things." "Was it you?" She smoothed the tape on his IV line and straightened up. Try to sleep, Gerald. You've got a father-daughter dance to practice for. He looked at her for a long moment with the kind of look that older people sometimes had, the one that communicated that they'd lived long enough to know when a person was carrying something heavy and had decided to carry it gracefully. Thank you, he said, for earlier, when you told me to stay in the bed and trust you. You did good, she said. That was all you. She left him and walked out of the ER and through the service entrance into the pre-dawn air of downtown Seattle. It was cold. The city was still dark, but the sky to the east was starting to change color in the specific way it did in September, that first thin line of not quite black that meant morning was coming, whether the night was finished with you or not. There were news vans outside the main entrance. She could see the lights from where she was standing at the service door, bright mobile turning the front of the building into a kind of arena. Someone was already on camera. She could hear the rhythm of a broadcast without being able to make out the words. She was going to be part of the story by morning, she knew that. Probably by the time she woke up. The FBI would try to control the narrative, but the narrative was going to move faster than anyone's ability to control it, because this was the kind of story that traveled a hospital attack, a federal witness, a mercenary team, and somewhere in the middle of all of it, a woman in nursing scrubs who nobody had seen coming. She pulled her jacket tighter and started walking toward her apartment 4 blocks away, and she was halfway down the first block when her phone rang. Unknown number. She looked at it for 3 steps. Then she answered. Cooper, said a voice she recognized instantly because there were voices you spent years trying to forget and didn't succeed. It was a man's voice, level and familiar, carrying the specific cadence of someone who chose every word before saying it. She stopped walking. Colonel Hargrove, she said, I heard about tonight. A pause. I would say I'm surprised, but that would be dishonest. Richard Hargrove, her commanding officer for the last 3 years of her service. The man who had written her discharge papers, shaken her hand, and told her with his particular brand of professional warmth that the Army was losing something it wouldn't be able to replace. She hadn't spoken to him since the day she handed in her credentials. How did you hear? She asked. Word travels fast when it involves someone from one of my former units. I'm not from a unit anymore. No, he said. You're a nurse in Seattle. A pause that lasted long enough to mean something. The DOJ call was me 40 minutes ago. The leak Cole told you about in the criminal division. They've been running a quiet investigation into that department for 6 months. Cole's information lines up with what they already had. They're moving on it in the next 12 hours. He paused again. They wanted to know how a nursing staff member at a civilian hospital had obtained actionable intelligence from a captured contractor in under 5 minutes. I asked him the right questions, Ava said. You always did. She could hear something in his voice that she recognized, not sentiment Hargrove didn't do sentiment, but the particular quality of respect that he reserved for the moments he thought someone had done something genuinely well. The FBI field office in Seattle is going to want you in a formal debrief, not tonight, in the next few days. It won't just be about tonight. She stood on the sidewalk with the cold air coming off Puget Sound and the sound of news vans 2 blocks behind her. What will it be about? They're going to ask you to consult, Hargrove said, on the Cole investigation and on the trafficking case that Reyes is building. You were inside the operation tonight in a way that no other witness was. You have a working knowledge of Cole's team structure, his communication protocols, his tactical patterns. That's valuable in a way that a debrief alone doesn't capture. She processed that. I'm a nurse. You're a nurse who held a 5-floor hospital alone for 90 minutes, Hargrove said, and his voice was still even, still professional, but something underneath it had shifted. Ava, you don't have to go back to anything you walked away from. But there are people who were helped tonight because of both halves of what you are. That's not something that goes away because you want a quiet life. The cold was getting into her jacket. She started walking again slowly. Is this an official call? Semi-official. I was asked to make contact by people who thought you'd receive it better from a familiar voice. A pause. They were probably right. Tell them I'll think about the consultation. That's all I'm passing on. Hargrove. She stopped again. Was any of tonight preventable, the attack? If your people had known Cole was operating in the city. We didn't know, he said. The contract was very well concealed. Cole has always been careful. He paused. If you hadn't been in that building tonight, Reyes would be dead. The witness protection program would have a significant failure on its record, and a trafficking operation responsible for the exploitation of several hundred people would still be operational. He said it plainly without drama, the way he always stated things that were difficult but true. You know as well as I do that the answer to your question is yes and no, and that neither answer changes what happened. She did know that. She'd known it for the past 4 years, applied to a different question about a different night, and she'd been living inside the ambiguity of that knowledge ever since. I'll be in touch about the consultation, she said. I know you will. Another pause. Get some sleep, Cooper. He ended the call. She stood on the sidewalk for a moment with the phone in her hand, and then she put it in her jacket pocket and kept walking. The city was waking up around her, the first trucks on the arterial roads, the lights in apartment windows on upper floors, the sound of a coffee shop unlocking its front doors somewhere behind her. The ordinary machinery of an ordinary morning assembling itself piece by piece out of the dark. She was 2 blocks from her apartment when she became aware that she wasn't alone on the sidewalk. She noticed it the way she always noticed things, not with alarm, but with the particular low-frequency attention that ran underneath all her other thoughts, like a current. Footsteps behind her, matching her pace, consistent distance, not gaining, not falling back. Someone who knew how to follow without appearing to follow. She turned a corner. The footsteps turned with her. She stopped in front of a darkened storefront and looked at the glass, which gave her a reflection of the street behind her. One person, male, medium-height, hands in jacket pockets, moving at a pace that was slightly off, slightly too deliberate for someone who was just walking home. She turned around. The man stopped. He was young, mid-30s, unremarkable, wearing the kind of clothes that were specifically designed to not stand out. He looked at her with the specific expression of someone who has just been caught doing something they hoped they wouldn't be caught doing and is now deciding how to pivot. If you're press, Ava said, I have nothing to say. I'm not press, the man said. Then who are you? He reached into his jacket pocket. Slowly, she tracked the movement without moving herself and pulled out a business card which he held out at arm's length, as if he understood very well that she needed to be able to see it before anyone's hands got any closer to each other. She took it. Read it again. The card had a name, a title, a phone number. No agency logo, no address, just text on white stock. The name was not one she knew. The title read Office of Strategic Coordination, National Security Division. She looked up at him. Ms. Cooper, the man said carefully, my office has been aware of the situation at St. Mary's since approximately 2 hours ago. We have some questions that are separate from the FBI's investigation and above the classification level of the debrief Agent Mathers will be scheduling. You followed me from the hospital. We've been outside the hospital since the police arrived. We wanted to speak with you privately. He kept his tone completely even. My director wanted to make contact tonight specifically, before the morning news cycle creates a narrative that becomes difficult to work around. She looked at the card again. Work around how? Ms. Cooper Cole's operation tonight was one piece of a larger structure that your government has been tracking for 14 months. The man who hired him, the one whose trafficking operation Reyes is testifying against, is not just a criminal. He has connections to foreign intelligence operations in 3 countries. The case that goes to trial Tuesday is the visible tip of something significantly larger. He paused. The intelligence Cole gave you about the DOJ leak is consistent with what we already know, but there are 2 other pieces of information that Cole may have referenced either directly or in passing that my office needs to understand before Tuesday morning. Ava looked at the man on the sidewalk, at the business card in her hand, at the sleeping city around them, at the pale edge of morning light that was now definitively beginning to show on the eastern horizon. She thought about Hargrove's voice on the phone. She thought about Mathers across the conference table. She thought about what Cole had said in the basement, not the part about Marcus being alive, but the part before it, when he'd been assessing her, when he'd said something she hadn't fully weighted at the time. He'd said, who sent you here? And she'd said, nobody. And he'd said, you're telling me this entire night happened because a former Army sniper happened to be working her regular nursing shift in the building my team hit. And she'd said yes. And he'd said, that is extraordinary bad luck. She turned the business card over. On the back in handwriting rather than print was a time and an address. This morning, 6 hours from now. Whoever had read in it had assumed she would come, which was either confidence or arrogance, or an accurate read of who she was. She looked at the man. 2 pieces of information, she said. What specifically? A name, he said, and a location. Cole had a meeting 2 days before this operation with an individual whose identity we need to confirm. We believe he said something in your presence tonight, possibly without you realizing its significance, that could help us confirm both. She ran the conversation with Cole back through her head. The stairwell, the corridor, the basement, everything he'd said in sequence, every word the exact phrasing. And then she found it. Not a name, not quite, but a reference, a casual, unguarded reference that Cole had made in the conference room when he thought he was talking to his own man. Something she'd filed away without knowing why, because that was what training built into you: file everything, evaluate later. Her stomach moved in a way it hadn't moved since the basement. I think, she said slowly, that you should give me 6 hours to sleep, and then we should have a very careful conversation. The man nodded. The address on the card. I'll be there, she said. She put the card in her jacket pocket and turned and walked the remaining 2 blocks to her apartment building and let herself in and climbed the stairs to the 3rd floor and unlocked her door and went inside and stood in her own kitchen in the pre-dawn quiet with the refrigerator humming and her jacket still on and her keys in her hand. She stood there for a long time. Then she took her jacket off and hung it on the chair by the door and went to the window and looked out at the street. A delivery truck was moving slowly up the block. A light was on in the apartment across the way, someone awake early or awake still moving behind the curtains in the specific hunched silhouette of a person making coffee. The city settling into its morning shape, indifferent and continuous and entirely unaware of what had happened 4 blocks east of here in a building full of people who were alive right now in ways they hadn't been certain of 3 hours ago. She thought about Marcus Webb in surgery at Harborview. She thought about the business card in her jacket pocket. She thought about Garrett Cole in a federal holding cell somewhere in this city, working through his own accounting of the night and the thing he'd said that she hadn't fully registered until this moment on this sidewalk. The reference, the name that wasn't a name, but was the edge of one, the geographic detail dropped into a sentence, the way people drop things when they weren't being careful. She thought about the fact that the trafficking operation Reyes was testifying against the thing that had put a mercenary team inside St. Mary's on a Tuesday night was the visible tip of something significantly larger. She sat down at her kitchen table. She did not sleep. She took the business card out of her jacket and set it on the table and looked at the address written on the back in handwriting that was careful and precise. And she thought about Hargrove's voice on the phone saying, "You don't have to go back to anything you walked away from." And she thought about what she'd told Jason in the corridor. I stopped pretending I could keep the 2 halves separate. And she thought about how for 4 years she had built a life that was whole and real and genuinely hers, and how tonight had not broken that life, but had revealed something about it that she'd been almost ready to see. Almost. She was ready now. She put the card back in her pocket and went to her bedroom and lay down on top of the covers with her shoes still on and set an alarm for 5 hours and 40 minutes and closed her eyes. And for the first time in 4 years, she slept without dreaming about Kandahar. The alarm went off at 6:42 in the morning and Ava was already awake. She'd been awake for the last 20 minutes lying on top of her covers with her shoes still on, staring at the ceiling and running through the thing Cole had said in the conference room. The reference she'd almost missed, the geographic detail dropped casually into a sentence. The way people dropped things when they believed they were among allies. She'd filed it in the back of her mind during the longest night of the past 4 years, and now in the thin gray morning light of her apartment, she turned it over carefully the way you turned over something fragile and potentially dangerous, making sure of its shape before you committed to holding it fully. She got up, showered, changed into her own clothes for the first time in 12 hours, made coffee and stood at the kitchen counter and drank it black and didn't check her phone until the second cup because the news cycle had gotten there ahead of her. She could already tell from the volume of notifications stacking up that the story had broken wide open overnight and that her name was somewhere in the middle of it and that the version of her life that had existed before 11:47 last night was already becoming a different version of itself. She checked one message from Priya sent at 4 a.m. I don't know who you are, but I'm glad you were here. Also, your locker is full of reporters' business cards that were shoved under the ER door. I put them in the trash. You're welcome. Ava smiled, set the phone down, finished the coffee. At 7:15, she put the business card in her jacket pocket and walked out the door. The address on the card was a federal building 12 blocks from the hospital, which told her that the man on the sidewalk had been telling the truth about his affiliation. Civilian contractors didn't use federal buildings, and people trying to mislead her wouldn't have picked a location she could verify in under 60 seconds on her phone. She walked all 12 blocks because she needed the air, and because walking gave her time to think, and because whatever was waiting for her at that address she intended to arrive at with her mind completely clear. The building was unremarkable. She was met at the security desk by a woman she'd never seen before, taken up 2 floors in an elevator, and walked down a corridor to a conference room that was smaller and quieter than the one at St. Mary's had been last night. The man from the sidewalk was there. Across from him sat a woman in her 60s with silver hair cut short and the specific posture of someone who had spent decades being the most important person in whatever room she occupied and had stopped needing anyone else to acknowledge it. The man from the sidewalk said, "Ms. Cooper, this is Deputy Director Ann Caldwell." Ava sat down. Caldwell looked at her for a moment, the direct, unhurried look of someone taking a full accounting, and then she said, "You slept." 5 hours, Ava said. "Enough." "Good." Caldwell folded her hands on the table. "I'm going to tell you things in this room that require your discretion. Not because I'm asking you to keep secrets, I imagine you're tired of that, but because the operational integrity of an active investigation depends on what stays inside these walls for the next 72 hours. Can we agree on that?" "Depends on what you tell me," Ava said. Caldwell's expression shifted minimally, not displeasure, something closer to satisfaction. "Fair answer. Let me give you the framework, and you can decide." She paused. "The man who hired Garrett Cole, his name is Victor Leland. He runs legitimate shipping and import operations out of Portland, Vancouver, and Anchorage. The trafficking operation underneath it has been active for 6 years. Reyes built the case over 3 years, and it is solid. It goes to trial Tuesday. That part you know." She stopped. "What you don't know is that Leland is also a financial intermediary for a foreign intelligence network operating across the Pacific Northwest. We identified this connection 14 months ago. The trafficking prosecution is real and necessary, but it is also, from our perspective, the smaller problem." Ava looked at her steadily. "The larger problem being the intelligence network." "The larger problem being that dismantling the intelligence network requires knowing the identity of its domestic coordinator. Someone based in this region. Someone with access to law enforcement databases, federal court schedules, and as of 6 months ago, the identity and location of protected witnesses." Caldwell paused. "The leak in the DOJ criminal division that Cole told you about isn't just someone feeding information to Leland about the trial date. It's the coordinator. It's the same person. One individual, 2 functions, 6 years of undetected access." The weight of that landed across the table, and Ava felt it settle into her understanding of everything that had happened in the last 12 hours. Not a corrupt bureaucrat protecting a criminal client, a foreign intelligence asset embedded in the Department of Justice, using a trafficking prosecution as cover for information extraction, and a mercenary operation as a solution when the cover was about to be blown by a trial. "What did Cole say?" she asked. "The specific thing. You said your officer believed I might have heard something without recognizing its significance." Caldwell looked at the man from the sidewalk. He opened a folder and read, "In the administrative conference room at St. Mary's approximately 11:45 last night, Cole made a radio communication referencing a secondary extraction point. He used the phrase waterfront relay. Our signals intelligence has been tracking a communication pattern using that exact phrase for 11 months. It references a specific location on the Seattle waterfront where physical document drops have been made on 4 occasions. We've never been able to identify who is receiving those drops." Ava thought back to the conference room door. 3 inches open, Cole's voice measured and certain issuing instructions. And yes, she had heard it. She'd heard it and filed it, and it had been underneath everything else the whole night waiting. "He didn't say it on the radio," she said. "He said it to the man in the room with him. He said the extraction window was gone, and if the asset needed to go dark, the waterfront relay was still clean." She paused. Then the other man asked if that was confirmed, and Cole said the relay doesn't know about tonight. Those were his words. The relay doesn't know about tonight. Caldwell went very still, which means the relay and the person who hired Cole are different people. Ava said. Cole was keeping the two operations separate. Leland hired him to handle the witness problem. The waterfront relay, whoever that is Cole's separate contact. The intelligence side. Caldwell looked at the man from the sidewalk. He was writing rapidly. That's what you needed, Ava said. It wasn't a question. That confirms the separation of the two networks, Caldwell said, which means the domestic coordinator is not Leland. Leland is a client, not the source. The coordinator is someone who has been operating completely independently, using Leland's network as cover without Leland even knowing the full picture. She stopped. That changes the prosecution strategy for Tuesday significantly. Then you need to tell Reyes, Ava said. We will, carefully. Caldwell looked at her. Ms. Cooper, I want to ask you something directly and I want a direct answer. Go ahead. In the basement last night, Cole gave you information he didn't have to give you. The DOJ leaked Marcus Webb being alive, things a man in his position had no tactical reason to share. She paused. Why do you think he did that? Ava had been thinking about that since the basement. She'd been thinking about it on the walk to this building and on the 5 floors of stairwell at St. Mary's and in the pre-dawn kitchen of her apartment. She had an answer. She wasn't entirely sure she was comfortable with the answer. Because he recognized me, she said, not personally, professionally. He knew what I was from how I moved through that building, and he respected it enough to be honest with me once the game was over. She paused. Men like Cole have a code. It's not a good code, and it's not a moral code, but it's consistent. He'd lost. He told me what he thought I needed to know, because in his framework, that was the right thing to do at the end of a clean fight. Caldwell studied her for a moment. And the information about Marcus Webb. That was different, Ava said quietly. He saw that Marcus mattered to me. I don't know why he cared. Maybe he didn't want to be responsible for a death he didn't have to be responsible for. Maybe he was just being honest. She stopped. I don't need him to be a good man. I just need to understand what he gave me and why. Caldwell nodded slowly. One more question, and this one is not about last night. She paused long enough that Ava understood the weight of what was coming. The Office of Strategic Coordination has a consultant program. We work with individuals who have specific field experience that our permanent staff doesn't cover. The program is part-time, the contracts are short-term, and the work is advisory analysis, debrief, pattern identification. It doesn't require you to leave Seattle. It doesn't require you to leave nursing. She met Ava's eyes. Would you be willing to consider it? Ava looked at her, at the man from the sidewalk, at the folder on the table with her own name on the tab, which she'd been aware of since she sat down and had been choosing not to look at directly. What does consideration look like? She asked. It looks like you taking 48 hours and thinking about it seriously. Then calling the number on the card. Caldwell paused. No pressure in any direction. If your answer is no, we thank you for last night and for this morning, and we don't contact you again. And if my answer is yes, then we have another conversation, a longer one. Caldwell stood, which meant the meeting was over. She extended her hand across the table. You did something extraordinary last night, Miss Cooper. Not just tactically. You made decisions in real time that protected civilian lives while maintaining operational awareness that most trained professionals would have lost inside the first 20 minutes. That's not something we see often. Ava shook her hand. I'm a nurse, she said. Protecting people in high-stress situations is the job description. Yes, Caldwell said, and something in her voice was almost warm. I suppose it is. Ava walked back out into the morning. She stood on the sidewalk outside the federal building, with the city moving around her buses, pedestrians, the sound of a construction crew 2 blocks north, and she took a full breath of cold Seattle air and let it out slowly and stood there being a person who had just been offered a thing she hadn't known she was waiting to be offered. She walked back toward the hospital. Not because her shift had started, it hadn't, and she wasn't back until Thursday, but because there was something she needed to finish before she could close the book on the night. Harborview Medical Center was 6 blocks from St. Mary's. She walked it in 9 minutes, went inside, found the surgical wing reception desk, and gave Marcus Webb's name to the woman at the desk, who looked at her visitor information and then looked at Ava's face and said, "Are you family?" "I'm his colleague," Ava said. "I was with him last night." The woman looked at her for a moment longer than necessary. Then she said, "He came out of surgery at 4:30 this morning. He's in recovery. He's stable." She paused. "His mother is with him. Room 318. Avia took the elevator to the 3rd floor and walked to 318 and stood outside the door for a moment. Through the small window, she could see Marcus in the bed, pale and still connected to monitoring equipment, and beside him, a woman in her late 50s with her son's same broad forehead and strong hands sitting in the chair closest to the bed, with her hand wrapped around his and her head slightly bowed in the way of someone who had been praying or had been past prayer and was now just present, which was sometimes the same thing. Ava did not go in. This was not her moment. This belonged to the woman in the chair and the young man in the bed and the 11 millimeters of space between the life they had and the one they'd almost lost. She stood at the window for 30 seconds. Then she turned and walked back to the elevator. She was back on the street 2 blocks from Harborview when her phone rang. She looked at the screen. St. Mary's administration. She answered, "Miss Cooper." It was the hospital's chief medical officer, Dr. Patricia Hale, a woman Ava had spoken to maybe 4 times in 9 months, always briefly, always professionally. "I've been trying to reach you since 6 this morning." "I was in a meeting," Ava said. "I understand. I wanted to speak with you directly before," Hale paused, "before the official process begins. There are several things happening simultaneously at administrative level right now, and I want to make sure you hear from me personally rather than through formal channels." "What kind of things?" Ava asked. "The hospital board is meeting at 10 this morning. The agenda includes, among other items, a formal recognition of the staff members who responded during last night's event. Your name is at the top of that list." A pause. "There is also a conversation happening about your employment status." Ava stopped walking. "My employment status?" "Not in a negative sense," Hale said quickly. "Nothing about last night changes your position here in any adverse way. What the board is considering is whether your current role adequately reflects your," she paused, choosing the word carefully, "your full range of capabilities. There has been discussion of a senior crisis coordination position, something that formalizes the kind of leadership you exercised last night within the hospital's emergency response structure." Eva stood on the sidewalk. A bus went past. Someone on a bicycle rang their bell at a pedestrian. The ordinary city moving. "Dr. Hale," she said, "can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Before last night, in the 9 months I've been on staff, was there anything about my performance that wasn't adequate?" A pause. "No, your performance has been excellent. And then I'd like to keep doing what I've been doing," Ava said. "The same role, the same floor, the same patients." She paused. "I'm not opposed to the crisis coordination conversation, but I don't want to leave the ER. That's where the work is." Hale was quiet for a moment. "I'll convey that to the board. Thank you. Ms. Cooper, Ava." Hale's voice shifted slightly, became something more personal, less administrative. "I've been a physician for 31 years. I've worked with a lot of people. I want you to know that what you did last night, the specific choices you made, the way you prioritize patients over your own safety, that is not something I take lightly. Whatever your background, whatever your history, you are an exceptional nurse. I wanted to say that directly." Ava stood on the sidewalk in the September morning and felt the words land in a place that was different from where professional recognition usually landed. Not her chest, somewhere deeper. "Thank you," she said, and meant it in a way that surprised her. She put the phone in her pocket and kept walking. The story broke fully by 10 that morning. She knew because her phone became too loud to keep in her pocket, and she switched it to silent and kept walking, and because when she passed a coffee shop with a television mounted in the corner, she could see the graphic on the news channel behind the anchor's bed. Seattle hospital attack nurse identified as decorated Army sniper. There was a photo, her Army service photo, which was public record, which she'd always known was out there, but which she had never had a reason to look at in 4 years. She looked at it through the coffee shop window for 2 seconds and then looked away and kept walking. It was out now. All of it. The name, the service record, the 12 years, the combat deployments, the broad strokes of who she'd been before she became who she was. The story was going to have a life of its own for a while, and she was going to have to live alongside it, and that was the reality she was walking into with her eyes open. She was ready. She turned the corner onto her block and found Jason Lee sitting on the front steps of her apartment building. He was still in yesterday's clothes, which meant he'd come straight from the hospital, and he was holding 2 cups of coffee in a cardboard tray and looking at the street with the expression of a man who had been awake for too long and was making peace with it. He saw her coming and stood up. She took the offered cup. "You look terrible," she said. "I've been awake for 26 hours. He said, "You look fine. How are you fine?" "Practice." She stood beside him on the steps. "You could have called." "I wanted to come in person." He looked at his coffee. "I watched the news this morning. They're talking about you like they're making it into something very large and very loud." "I know. How do you feel about that?" She thought about it honestly. "Complicated," she said, "but manageable." He nodded. He was quiet for a moment, the particular quiet of someone who has organized everything they want to say and is now deciding the order. "I owe you an apology," he said finally. She looked at him. "For what?" "For every assumption I made. In 9 months of working beside you, I thought I knew. I thought I understood the kind of person you were. I had a version of you in my head that was—" He stopped. "It was incomplete, and I never thought to look harder." He looked at her directly. "I should have looked harder." "Jason," she turned to face him, "the version of me you knew was real. Every part of it. I wasn't performing anything. I was exactly who I appeared to be. I just had additional information about myself that I didn't share." She paused. "That's true of most people." He absorbed that. "The things you said last night, to the patients, to the staff." He stopped again. "Priya told me what you said to her in the corridor right at the beginning before anyone knew how bad it was. She said you put your hand flat in the air like this and the whole room went quiet. She said it was the calmest she'd ever seen anyone be in a situation that was the opposite of calm. She did the hard part," Ava said. "She stayed and she kept broadcasting when everything in her was telling her to run. That takes more courage than most people realize. She said the same thing about you." He looked at her steadily. "She said she didn't know what you were, but she knew you were going to bring everyone home. She could feel it." He paused. She was right. Ava looked at him, at the honest open face of a man who was one of the best surgeons she'd ever worked beside, and who had spent 9 months being her colleague and was now in some way she didn't have a word for, yet becoming something else. Not romantic, that wasn't the shape of it. Something more durable. The specific bond that formed between people who had been in crisis together and come out the other side with their accounting of each other permanently revised. "How's the floor?" she asked. "Operational. Battered but operational." He managed something close to a smile. "Damon ran the whole thing from midnight to 7. Wouldn't let anyone tell him to go home. Sandra came back in at 6 even though her insulin situation was nowhere near resolved, and Dolores called me from the ICU at 8 to inform me that all 47 patients were stable and that if anyone from administration tried to reschedule the night nursing staff's vacation time, she would take it as a personal affront." He paused. "Those are your people." "They're good people," Ava said. "They are, because you trusted them to be." He looked at her. "That's what you did last night, Ava. You didn't just fight. You trusted every single person on that floor to rise to what was being asked of them." Priya on the intercom, Sandra in the corridor, Damon with the clipboard, Gerald in base 7 staying in his bed and not asking questions. He stopped. "You gave people the chance to be more than they thought they were capable of, and they were." She hadn't thought about it that way. She'd been so focused on the tactical, the operational, the step-by-step mechanics of moving through a building and making decisions in fractions of seconds that she hadn't fully seen the other thing happening, in parallel the chain of ordinary people doing extraordinary things because someone had told them they could and trusted them enough to mean it. She felt something shift in her chest. Not break, she was done with things breaking. Shift, settle, like a bone that had been healing at a slightly wrong angle finally finding its correct position. I need to sleep, she said. He laughed, a real laugh, brief and exhausted, the laugh of someone who had been holding tension for too long and had just found a place to release it. Yes, he said. You should do that. He handed her the second coffee from the tray and went down the steps and started walking, and she stood on her own front steps and watched him go and thought that the city was full of people who had spent last night afraid and were spending this morning relieved, and that somewhere in that city, a 24-year-old named Marcus Webb was waking up in a hospital bed with his mother's hand in his, and the specific disoriented gratitude of someone who had been very close to a line and had not crossed it. She thought about the business card in her pocket. She thought about Caldwell's voice saying you'd made decisions in real time that protected civilian lives, and Hargrove's voice saying you don't have to go back to anything you walked away from, and Priya sitting on the floor with the intercom in her lap saying, I don't know who you are, but I'm glad you were here. She went inside. She climbed the stairs to her apartment and unlocked the door and went to her kitchen table and sat down. She set both coffees on the table. She took the business card out of her pocket and set it beside them. She picked up her phone. She had 43 missed calls and over 200 messages, and she set all of it aside and found the one number she was looking for, not in her recent calls, not in her contacts, but in the back of her memory where she'd kept it for 4 years, in the specific way you kept a number you never expected to use again. She dialed. It rang twice. Cooper, said Hargrove. I'm going to take the consultation, she said, but I need you to understand something first. I'm not coming back, not to what I was. I'm a nurse in Seattle, and that is not a cover story, and it is not a temporary arrangement. It is what I am. Whatever I contribute to whatever your colleagues at Strategic Coordination need, it comes from this life, from this work, from what I've learned in 9 months of third shift trauma nursing. It doesn't come from Kandahar. It doesn't come from 2019. She paused. Is that understood? A pause on his end, then understood. Then I'll call Caldwell this afternoon. Good, he said. And then in the voice he reserved for moments, he considered the closing of something significant. Cooper, you never stopped being the best operator I ever worked with. The difference is that now you know it doesn't have to cost you everything to be that. She held the phone to her ear for a moment after he finished speaking. Then she set it down on the table beside the business card and the 2 cups of coffee and sat in the quiet of her own kitchen in the late morning of a Wednesday in September. Outside her window, the city was fully alive. Trucks' voices, the sound of the waterfront somewhere in the distance, the ordinary continuous pulse of a place that moved forward regardless of what any single night had cost it or given it. She had lived in this city for 9 months and had spent most of that time being quietly invisible inside it, and now she was part of its story in a way she hadn't chosen but was choosing to accept. She thought about Gerald, who would be discharged in 2 days and would go home and practice his father-daughter dance in his living room until he got it right. She thought about Priya, who would come in for her next shift and do her job with the same care and competence she'd always brought, and who would carry the knowledge of what she'd done in the dark corridor forever. She thought about Marcus Webb, who was going to wake up fully and eat hospital food and complain about it, and eventually go back to the front desk of St. Mary's, where he had always been and where he belonged. She thought about the waterfront relay that Caldwell's team was going to identify in the next 72 hours, using the fragment of information Cole had dropped into a sentence he thought no one significant was hearing. She thought about the trial on Tuesday and what it meant for 300 people whose names she didn't know, but whose lives had been taken from them systematically by a man who treated human beings as line items in a shipping manifest. She picked up one of the coffees and drank it, and it was exactly the right temperature, and she sat with it in both hands and let herself be still. She had not saved the hospital last night because she was exceptional. She had saved it because she was prepared, because she had been paying attention for 12 years to the specific ways that human beings were capable of protecting each other when they chose to. And because when the moment came, she had made a decision, not the easy decision, not the safe decision, but the true one. She was going to keep making that decision. Here in this city, on this floor, in Bay 7 and Bay 12, in the ICU, in the corridors where people came in broken and left less broken. And occasionally when the other thing was needed, she was going to be that too. Both halves. Same person. No more bows, no more walls between what she'd been and what she was, no more apologizing for the sudden and shape of everything she was capable of. Ava Cooper set the coffee cup down, picked up her phone, and called Caldwell's number. And when the line connected, she said clearly and without hesitation, "This is Ava Cooper. I'm ready to talk."